This is round 14 of 15 from the 2014 Rapid Chess Championship. Carlsen has white versus Alexander Grischuk, and he opens with d4. You see a King's Indian defense, Samish with f3, and we have this a6 and c6 idea being employed by black. This is the one game where I really felt black really did better in the opening, middle game, really did well, very direct play, and had a fantastic advantage very quickly. You'll notice I didn't point this out in any of the other videos that I covered from this tournament. You'll notice the ratings, these are rapid ratings, and so, Grischuk is up there, the faster time controls, he's just increases in strength, it seems. But anyhow, okay, a6 and c6, this is prepping b5 to challenge the white center in some way. So, white interferes with this idea with c5, b5 is still played, and we're looking at something like b4 maybe one day to kick the knight away. In reply, we don't have capture en passant. Instead, it's c takes d, e takes d, so that can't be bad, right? We have the exchange of pawns. The e file is now half opened. Black is the side who is better developed. Well, actually, I don't know if I would go that far. There's still some work. Let's say, I can maybe say it like this. White needs some more work before they could be assured that their king is safe. Still has some kingside development. Black, no issues. The king is fine. So, okay, knight f4. This bishop needs to get out before he could castle, of course. Rook to e8, half open file, and this bishop is unprotected. So, there are tactics brewing. Bishop e2, b4 kicks the knight from doing what? From controlling d5. Why is that important? Notice black's next move, knight d5, exploiting this pin. If knight takes knight, pawn takes. This pawn is hit again. A lot of pressure. We don't have that, though. We don't have knight takes knight. Instead, bishop c1. The computer is recommending at this point knight takes f4, but I guess that was shied away from in some way because of what? It's helping white to develop the bishop, but I guess there still is a good follow-up in that of d5, striking at the center. I really like the move Grischuk chose, knight to b6. It seems weird to want to maybe exchange a knight that's somewhat stranded over here on a4, but look at the wonderful position the queen takes up on b6. The threat, by the way, is to take on a4 and then take on d4. The current situation when the knight plays to b6 is that the queen is now overloaded, having to watch over d4 and the knight on a4. So this knight move is interfering with that. Those knights are exchanged, and this queen is hitting this pawn for now a second time. And it's defended, but notice this bishop is back on an unprotected square. This rook has potential to maybe do some damage to it. Maybe there's some tactics on this diagonal, and maybe there's some tactics on this diagonal versus against the bishop, and maybe even against the king. When white castles, guess where the king's going to be? On this same diagonal. So this is a very strong post on this b6 square. We'll see how strong soon enough. Become more evident. After d5, looking to break at the center, how do you reply? Fortunately, you have to simply defend. You can't push. You're getting crushed. Bishop takes here, exploiting the pin. That's not going to happen. So, queen to d3 was picked. Pawn takes, a5. Looking for bishop a6 with tempo. If these light square bishops are no longer around, there's a very sensitive point on the white king side. What square am I referring to of these four squares? This one right here. And this knight, he's on b8 right now, but wait until you see the journey he makes to g4. It seems like he gets there in a blink. And what I mean by that is once he gets to f6, he's getting there with tempo, and he's going to jump here with tempo. He's just going to be a nightmare. He's just going to be a monster once he gets to that g4 square. So this is very, very nice play. The position is opened right up. White is just one move away from being fully developed, but sometimes just being one move back is just one too many moves back in an open position like this. So, okay, rook to d1, bishop a6, the light square bishops come off, and now black is fully developed. White is now fully developed, but after knight to f6, this is very tough now. How do you defend e4? You push right here. Now we have knight g4, the bishop's hit. There's moves like this happening. Very tough situation. There's also this undermining move, which happens in the game, c5, breaking up this structure. Just strictly positional, knight here looks pretty nice, right? He's not going to be dislodged anytime soon, but certainly the more aggressive move, not going to the 5th rank, not staying on your side of the board, but planting a piece right in your opponent's territory, knight on g4 is very menacing. We didn't see that. We didn't see after knight f6, we didn't see e5. Instead it was knight g3, keeping the pawn secure for now a second time, but he's not doing much else. He's strictly a defensive piece. One move that cries out is h5 with h4 trying to kick him around, but I believe moves like that are going to be met. Like if h5, maybe at some point, if h5 is played, you'll most likely be seeing e5, kicking that knight away, and then if he moves, then at least the knight could be jumping into e4. But okay, excuse me, let me not get ahead of myself just too much. We didn't have h5, something more direct. Attack this bishop. Bishop f2. And now the last piece involved, you could just see the very, very good coordination on the black side. Not a better square, not any better squares for the rooks, not a better square really for the knight. The bishop and queen are converging, and black is just doing fantastic here. So e5 is picked, c5 is there to just break the center right open. D takes c5, queen to c7, and this pawn is hit. How many times? 3 times. He's defended how many? 0. He's going to be 1 back, and there's still this idea of taking the bishop. At the correct moment, there is simply no reason to capture him just yet. This knight is fine where he's at. Maybe he has other ideas if the bishop decides to go elsewhere. However, I'm not sure where that elsewhere type of move would be. But keep this knight in a strong position. No reason to take the bishop just yet. Knight e4, bishop takes, h2 is there. It's being hit for 3 times actually. Knight, bishop directly, the queen for a 3rd time indirectly. g3 defends, and now we have knight takes bishop. King takes, seeing some forcing continuation. Queen c6 hits the knight, and maybe looks forward to getting into the white position soon. Rook to e1, and now this is a moment, as you're seeing on the right hand side if you've been keeping an eye on the evaluation, this is a big moment here. f5 would have been killing. Right here, f5. There is a check that you could throw in, and then the knight could move, but now we have bishop d4, and apparently one of the best moves is to give up the queen. This should be still lights out, right? You get this fork, you get this back, but this is going to be a very difficult one to try and save for Team White. Very difficult to stay coordinated. White can also push through a passed pawn 3 versus 2, a healthy 3 versus 2 on the king side. So we didn't have that. We didn't have f5 at this point. We had first the bishop check. Let's look once more at this f5 move. f5, queen check, king f8, knight here. Is there something other than queen takes bishop? What if king here? Well, now you're already seeing mate and 6 stuff. I don't even feel like playing through it. You get the idea. There's these checks, discovered checks happening. Okay, bishop takes, and then you have to block with the queen and take the queen. You get the idea. But the immediate f5, the difference between f5 right now and f5 one move later, let's see what that difference is. When you play f5 now, notice that the knight doesn't have the f2 square. Once this bishop gives check, king f1, now f5 is played. Now the knight can play back to f2, and what is it doing? It's stopping queen h1. Very, very important detail. So, kicking the knight right now and not allowing him to come back and watch over this h1 square, you know, like this variation again. Once this bishop gives check, now he's got to come back here or go to the e2 square. Much, much different. This knight would really like to play to f2, and black, in a little bit of a way, helped white out, giving the check first, and only then kicking the knight to this f2 square. Okay, so the bishop picks up the pawn. Black is still clearly the better side. Having to now work out of this pin right here. You can't defend like this, queen c4, and that's going to be game over for black. So the way to get out of this pin is to give this check. King g2. Another check, king h3. We already saw this earlier. Carlsen had white versus Caruana, and his king ran to h3. All right, is he safe there, though? Bishop d4, the rook is hit. Carlsen picks up a pawn, and now another move right here, f4, looking to break down this structure. It's doing a couple things. One thing, you might as well use this as a battering ram. There really shouldn't be any hesitancy. If there's some concern, if you're on the black side and there's some concern about, oh, should I move a pawn further? Am I weakening my king position in any way? You're not weakening your king position in any way. He's not really that great of a defender. When you compare this, let's say when you compare the f5 pawn and the g3 pawn, if you could just imagine them both off the board, if the g3 pawn isn't around, you have moves like queen f3 with check. If there's ever some capture here, I'm just going to make a passing move. If there's some capture like this, maybe one day there's some check down here now that there's no longer an h pawn around. When you compare this f pawn to either of these two pawns, you would really like to get rid of this pawn, whether it be the g3 pawn or the h2 pawn. This king will be much more vulnerable. And on top of that, maybe even for more concrete reasons, after f4 is played, notice how this diagonal is now open straight to that king. Maybe one day there's some really good check that could be put to use by the black queen. So those are just general considerations. We didn't have f4 in this position, instead queen to b6, and that's where we see a fairly significant evaluation shift. After queen to b6, we're hovering around only slightly better for white, but look at the time situation. We're pretty much in bullet mode. Okay, they get 10 seconds increment with each move, but things are shifting, certainly. Rook to b5, queen to f6. The knight is finally doing something other than defending the king position. After g5, we have rook d5. The rooks are exchanged. The queen is very well placed. Queen to d5. King to g7. The knight picks up another pawn. Bishop takes. He is passed, and he gets running. Actually, another feature. I was talking about the game where Carlsen played against Caruana. His king played to g3, and what else happened in that game? He had a passed a pawn that ran really fast. That's interesting. I'm just noticing that now. Anyhow, okay, so after f4, king to g2, stopping any further advance to f3. Bishop c3, knight to d3, couple captures, knight to f2. A knight really close to the king does very well to defend queen checks. Offer of a queen exchange, I guess maybe this was a possibility, but I'm not sure. The bishop will be able to give itself up for this pawn, but will black be, can black be sure that these two pawns could somehow exchange itself off for this guy here? Apparently the computer is saying that, yeah, that's pretty much going to happen. Okay, so we didn't have the queen exchange. There really wasn't time to calculate that in full. That would, maybe even with much more time on the clock, that would be difficult to calculate, but certainly not with this time constraint. Queen to f3. bishop d4, we have a couple checks thrown in, and now the knight takes up a very central post, stopping any thought of queen checks on, let's say, e2. Here comes the pawn. He's immune from capture due to queen to d7. The bishop's picked up. So he's able to get to a5 and a6 soon. After h4, we need to retain some material on the board so we don't have these exchanges. g4. As white, you need to anticipate this bishop giving itself up for this pawn and you no longer having enough mating material. So we need to reserve some pawns on the board. We need to reserve this little guy. g4. The knight is there to watch over g3. There is no check. Bishop e3, queen check, and now we could give a queen trade. Now that we could be assured that these pawns will not be able to exchange themselves off as easily for this g4 pawn. There's a perfect blockade, king to h3, which will buy the knight time to come back over to the rescue and eat up these pawns. After the queens are traded, this knight simply guards a7 and pushes the pawn right through. So pawn push, king e6, knight b5, and similar to what we saw, I believe, in game 1 or round 1, where Carlsen played against Kirill Georgiev, there's no rush when your opponent's pieces are restricted in some way. The move played here was not a7, even though a7 would still win. The move played is first king to f3, establishing a better king position. We saw pretty much this same idea in that round 1 game. Establishing a position for your king, or a better position for your king. There's no rush with pushing this pawn through. Only after the bishop moves do we have this, and at this point black ends up resigning. The knight will just be able to come over very calmly and pick up these pawns. If this pawn tries to run, he's going to get tracked down. The king's there in time to defend. The knight comes over to the rescue. Just to show this position right here, even if white didn't make this king f3 move and pushed here, this is still winning. Just to show you, the king plays to h3, of course. You need to defend that pawn. And this knight could always come all the way over to simply attack this pawn. For example, something like this. Let's just say knight here, you're attacking this pawn. If king here, well, now we could do something like this. Have the king come over like this and have the knight come to that h3 square. That would be one idea. But if the king plays here, notice how there's knight takes h4. And if takes, this is a one king and pawn endgame. So however you slice it, it's really just, as they say, it's just a matter of technique, but it's really by having good technique, what are you doing? You're really saving yourself some calculation, or you're really not allowing your opponent to maybe find some interesting resource if things get a little bit more complicated. But as it was in this game, after this variation with first king f3 and only then pushing through knight takes bishop, it was at this point that Grischuk resigned. So that's all for this video. Feel free to click the annotation link at the end of this video for round 15, the final round of this tournament, or check in the video's description for links to the 14 other games.